Hello everyone, welcome to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel, with your host Rick Howard and Mike Maney.
Hello everyone. Welcome out to session number, what is it, Mike? 99?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's 99.
Didn't I say that last session?
We did. Well, this will be 99 part B.
Yeah, I messed up last session. I kept saying 99 and we were excited about being session 100 today, but it was actually session 98 last time. And I think we put that up on the video, or Derek Rhodes did. He put a notice that it's really only session 98. And, but at my age, I'm easily confused. And what I really wonder is, what is it going to be like when I'm your age? Are you like confused all the time? If I'm confused, good part of the time?
Yes. Yes. And you are fast approaching that age.
Yes, I am. I'll be 70 in October.
Yes.
I'm going to join your 70s decade.
Yeah.
So actually, I was really happy to find out I'd made a mistake, because we were, for some reason, I don't know why, felt prompted to finish Deuteronomy at session 100.
Yeah.
We still had chapters 32 and 33 and 34. And I knew chapter 32 deserved a whole session of its own. There's so much in there. Mm-hmm. And how I was going to condense that to finish the entire book in session 100, I didn't know how I was going to do that, because preachers are too, what are we, wordy, verbal. Mm-hmm. And so to find out, I actually have another session now. So I have two sessions to finish the book. So sometimes finding out that your mind slipped and you made a mistake works out in your favor.
Yes.
So, but before we jump into Deuteronomy 32, we have to talk about weather and politics for at least a few minutes, or Braden Barnum's going to boycott our channel.
Yes, you can boycott.
So today we're supposed to be 106. Today is August the 7th, 2024. And if August continues like a normal August, we probably will break our all-time record for number of days over 100 this summer. I think we're up to like 25 days over 100. I know July, the average high temperature in July was over 100, which is the first time ever. Mm-hmm. And August is starting out that hot. So I hate to wish time away, but I'm ready for this summer to be over as far as the heat goes. Of course, I chose like the hottest part of the year to start my 6-week treatment of, it's called Fluorosil. I call it chemo cream. I have so many precancerous spots all over my face and head that instead of liquid nitrogen, not being able to take care of it anymore, they just have me put this cream all over my face and head, and it burns and it itches and I start shedding my skin, and it's very uncomfortable. And I look a fright to go out in public. You can't tell it too much on this screen enough, but if you saw me in person, you'd probably run the other way.
But what was the upside? What was the upside of all of it, though?
The upside, my daughter said when I did this 5 or 10 years ago, that once I got over it and it healed, I looked 10 years younger.
Yeah.
So I'm getting ready to turn 70 in October. I told my wife, if I only look 65 when I turn 70 because of this, I'll be really happy.
Yeah.
So.
And then we're going to start calling you Benjamin Button.
Going backwards in age.
Oh, backwards.
That was a strange movie.
It was.
The kind of interesting idea. So I'm 3 weeks into this 6-week treatment. Mm-hmm. And so when I go out, of course I wear a hat and everything, but I go out in this heat, it's just like intensifies. It's like you already have a bad sunburn and you go out in the hot sun. So that wasn't too smart, but they wanted me to start it as soon as I could.
Yeah.
And just soon get it over with before better weather and our annual Cayucas trip in October and all that. I want to be able to take walks on the beach without being uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I decided to go ahead and jump in. And now I noticed, when I was there a few weeks ago, and you had that heat wave, you had 100-degree weather for several days and smoke from the fire. So you had your own weather grief. But I remember Vicky saying, she said, we usually hit our peak of hot weather toward the end of July. And she said, August, usually it starts cooling down already, which sounds strange to me because August is one of our hottest months.
Yeah.
But I noticed the next 10 days, you're not even going to have any high 80s. It's all going to be low 80s. So she was right. It's like 20 degrees cooler than it was just a few weeks ago.
Well, the rainstorm that just passed through yesterday helps to bring that temperature down. Yeah. We had thunder and lightning and marble-sized hail. So yeah, it brings the temperature down, it's a comfortable now. It's 78 right now. So
but it looks like in the forecast, you're not going to be above the low 80s till about at least the middle of August. So you may not have another 90 or 100-degree day the rest of the year, huh?
I hope not.
So I know you can have a big turn for the cooler weather by Labor Day some years, can't you?
Yeah, yeah.
So
yeah, and then I'll be wishing for this kind of.
Now we got to speak a few minutes about politics, because every day they're predicting that Iran is going to strike back at Israel for the assassinations that they committed.
Yes. Yeah.
And but every day they're wrong. And some of the predictions, and this has been my feeling, is that the Muslims often choose key dates of history, either Muslim key dates or Jewish key dates. And next Monday and Tuesday is the 9th of Av on the Jewish calendar, which is a day of mourning and grief because so many big, terrible events happened on or near that date in their history. It is the date that both the first temple and the second temple were destroyed by Babylon and by Rome. It's interesting that it happened on the same date of their calendar. The Jews also say this is not as provable historically, but Jewish tradition at least says this 9th of Av as a negative major event in their history actually began much earlier. They say it's the day that the 12 spies came back and the 10 gave the evil report, and God killed a bunch of them, and they had to wander around in the wilderness till that generation died off. So they say that was the 9th of Av. Whether it was or not, we're not sure. But and then the 9th of Av is closely connected with the Spanish Inquisition, where Spain issued the edict to kill or get rid of all the Jews in their Spanish Empire. And even connected with some events in World War I and II, and even since then. And I know you can, with anything, you can kind of press it too far, but it does appear this date is a kind of a day of disaster in their history.
I wonder.
And so it would be fitting if Iran chose that date to launch a major attack. Of course, the problem with that is one of the key principles of war is surprise. And so, you don't want to let them know exactly when you're going to do it, but they may decide it's worth it. Just go ahead and launch the attack on it'd be our next Monday, August the whatever that would be.
Is it Monday, Tuesday /
Yeah, Monday, Tuesday. Yeah, so the 12th.
I'm wondering if in the millennium, toward the end, when the devil's released, if it will be the 9th of Av on their calendar that he surrounds with all of his armies Jerusalem.
And you wonder if this ninth of Av, that he commits the abomination of desolation.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah,
I
all
don't
kinds
know.
of things we can
Yeah,
think
all
about.
kinds
Yeah,
of possibilities. I mean,
yeah.
it seemed like over there in the Middle East, they're all kind of fond of choosing particular dates of history
Hmm.
to do big things like that.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, but we'll know by next Monday and Tuesday if that's
Yeah,
the
right.
date. I know the United States and Russia and China and Britain, France, almost every major player is trying to calm things down, because if Iran tries something major, Israel's going to respond major, and then you have at least a regional war
Hmm.
uh, on a major scale, if not a world war. And certainly in this day of nuclear weapons, that's the last thing you want.
Hmm.
So, I mean, Israel, they have their, what they call it, their Samson um, plan, uh, that if they feel like they're going to be overwhelmed and defeated by numbers of armies and bombs and everything incoming, that they're just too small and can't absorb it all, uh, they'll do like Samson did. Lord, help me pull these pillars down on
Mm.
top of me. I'm going to die anyway, so I want to do as much damage as I can.
Wow.
So Israel has that kind of plan in place. I think I've read.
Hmm.
So it could get big and ugly really quick.
Hmm.
And at least if it's a regional war, it could easily uh, trigger what would become the Daniel 9:27 peace treaty.
Hmm.
Um, and that might be just right on the horizon, and very possibly. And
Hmm.
it's so interesting that so many of those prophecies, like Ezekiel 38, and even like there's quite a few places if you start looking it up, like Jeremiah 49 talks about the judgment on Elam, Elam, Elamites. You start looking up Elamites in the Old Testament because the Elamites were the ancient Persia, or part of Persia, part of modern Iran. Um, and there seems to be a lot of judgment scriptures in the prophets about them.
Hmm.
And then, of course, Ezekiel 38, they're the first on the list, Persia,
Hmm.
along with the other part of their group. Um, anyway, it's along with, as I've been saying this whole year, with what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, and then with our presidential election being the craziest election ever,
Hmm.
and especially the Democrats, it came out yesterday that a Democrat congressman, uh, he didn't intend for this to be overheard, that he was telling another group of them, said, um, if Trump gets elected, we need to have steps in place to prevent him from taking over the office. So,
Wow.
yeah, I mean, I really believe they're willing to go to any extreme to keep him from taking the office if he wins.
Mm.
Um, and so let me see. I've got something here. Something happened on my screen. Okay, I corrected it. So anyway, that's the politics of the day.
Hmm.
Changes every day. So
It does.
be aware. And the interesting thing to me about all of this is that Deuteronomy 32 is such a prophetic chapter. I call it what will we call it? The headwaters. Is that what you call where a river begins?
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
source?
Hmm.
I call it the headwater chapter, or the fountainhead would be another way to describe it. A chapter of most all prophecy that comes after it. So we say the single verse that is the fountainhead of prophecy is Genesis 3:15, and the rest of the Bible builds on that. We could say the same thing as Deuteronomy 32 being the fountainhead chapter that the rest of the Bible builds upon. Because so many things in this chapter are clearly end time predictions and descriptions. And even God himself had said that it's about the latter days. When he told Moses to write this song, we call it chapter 32, but it's really a song that they taught them to learn and to sing as a witness against themselves. All that's at the end of chapter 31. And it says in verse 29 of 31, "For I know that after my death, you will become utterly corrupt." What a thing to hear. Moses getting ready to die. They're getting ready to go conquer and possess and develop and inhabit their land. And yet, here's what God says about them. "And turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days." And that becomes a catchphrase throughout the rest of the Old Testament. And later, that term "in the latter days" would often be called "in that day" or "the day of the Lord." And sometimes it would be talking about a near-term judgment, but often built in it would also include a far-term judgment at the return of Christ.
There's a New Testament counterpart to this. So Moses is forecasting after his death, all things Israel are going to go south, right? Paul made the same prediction. After my departure, in Acts 20, grievous wolves will enter in, not sparing the flock. And so he was forecasting the demise they would have to face after Paul was gone to try to hold things in check.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
He didn't just say that wolves will come in among you from the outside. He said men will rise up among you.
Yeah.
And not sparing the flock, So
yeah.
Paul recognized that there was going to be extreme danger from without and from within. And the biggest danger we have is from within. We're not careful.
Yeah.
Throughout church history, the danger from without could not stop us. Actually, in many cases, it caused us to grow. The persecution from without. But when it rose from within, as it was already in the first century, Paul wouldn't have warned them about it otherwise, so that 5 of the 7 churches of Asia, at the end of the first century, most of them only organized less than 50 years, were told to repent and had all sorts of big problems within their church. So we can usually handle the danger from without. It's the danger from within that gets us.
Well, was it Esau's fable about the oxen who were threatened from the outside? So they formed a circle, and they had their hooves and their horns all facing the danger on the outside. They turned in and were facing outward, to take on the fight. So yeah, when we're approached from the outside, we have a tendency to group together and to fight as a collective. But then when it comes from the inside, that's a lot tougher because the deception is so strong.
Yeah, Jesus had already warned the first church about that early on, didn't he? When he would talk about things like brother shall forsake brother, children shall betray parents.
Yes.
Friends shall betray one another.
Yeah.
A betrayal of those within your own group.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's almost the biggest warning in the New Testament. And even like Israel, as long as they were serving God united in devotion and love to him, none of their enemies could defeat them.
Right.
But when they became corrupt within, their prophets and priests and kings and the people, idolatry and other types of sins, that's when God stepped in with judgment, because that was doing the greatest amount of harm to them. And I think we're kind of the same way.
Mhm.
So I say in this little single page summary I made of Deuteronomy 32, I have a 1 page summary, kind of like a 5 or 6 page overview of it. And then I have like I'll be sending all these out when the video comes out.
Okay.
Then I have an 11 page, what I call a deeper dive. So I have 3 different documents I've developed on Deuteronomy 32 because, I did this study years ago in the New Testament. I called it the pivotal chapters of the New Testament.
Mhm.
And there are certain chapters that are just pivotal, whatever subject, if it's resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, prophecy, Matthew 24. And so there's just certain key chapters that are so pivotal. And so I developed commentaries on maybe 15 of those chapters. And if I was to do the same thing in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 32 would be one of the pivotal chapters of the Old Testament. It really is just that important. I call it the headwaters prophetic chapter from which many streams and rivers flow.
Mhm.
That's a good way to look at Deuteronomy chapter 22.
And as I want, for our viewers' sake, Brother Rick and I have discussed turning his New Testament pivotal chapters into a booklet form. There's some formatting, and he wanted to kind of review those. But once he does that,
And once I do that,
once you do that, we'll get that into a book. And now I didn't even think about the pivotal chapters in the Old Testament. So if in the background, in your spare time, if you come up with pivotal chapters of the Old Testament, we'll make it one big book, Old and New Testament.
That would be interesting. One way to figure out what it would be to see which verses or chapters are highlighted in the New Testament from the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, you'd have to include, you think of the Psalms, so you think of, the 23rd Psalm is a favorite to many, and a lot of other great Psalms. But to the New Testament preachers and writers, it's Psalm 2 and Psalm 110.
Yes, it is.
Often quoted in the New Testament.
Yes.
So you'd have to include those. If you included a couple of Psalms in the pivotal chapters, it'd probably have to be those two among maybe a few others.
Mm-hmm.
Isaiah 53 certainly would be a pivotal chapter.
Yeah.
How
about Numbers? Is it Numbers 14? The 12 spies that rejected?
Yeah, 13 and 14. Yeah, there's certain ones.
So our viewers, write in and express your thoughts and your interest in Brother Rick putting this book together. I'm curious. Go ahead and send your comments into the channel.
Do you think we're going to get closer to 100 responses or 0 responses?
I'd be closer to 0, yes. I'll tell you what, I'll kick it off. I'll be the first one to request this. I'll kick it off. Okay.
So this in 31:29, when he talks about distress or evil in the latter days, so that's kind of the basis for what later is developed, like in Jeremiah 30 verse 7 of for that day it will be great. It is the time of Jacob's trouble. Mm-hmm. We take those two words, great trouble. Which is later then great tribulation. And Daniel 12:1, Matthew 24:21, certainly Revelation, a few places talks about the great tribulation. But the basis of it is right here, 31:29. This was written by God's direct commandment. He gave to Moses exactly what to write down. And then Moses' job was to teach them to learn it as a song, as a witness against themselves. But God is the one who gave him the words of this song. And so he starts off here, 32, with what we would call, what we have seen a lot in Deuteronomy, what we highlighted back in Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, and those verses there, the great Shema,
Mhm.
And that kind of language about pay attention, take heed, hearken,
Mhm.
give ear, it says here, at least in the New King James. Does the Old King James say maybe hearken? No, it says give ear, I think.
I think
I
so.
forget. Deuteronomy 32, verse 1,
Yeah. Give ear.
give ear.
Yeah.
That's a turn of phrase I like.
Mhm.
Give ear.
Mhm. Yeah.
We don't talk quite that way today,
Yeah.
but it's pretty graphic. It's kind of
Yeah.
a dramatic way of saying it.
Lend me your ear. Lend me your ears.
It just means to hear and to obey.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Pay
Yeah.
attention,
Yeah.
hearken. So give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and hear, O earth, the words of my mouth. So it's as if God is calling to attention every living creature in heaven and earth.
Mhm.
So it's almost God's way of saying, pay attention to this song because there's a whole lot of important truth in it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Let my teaching drop as the rain and my speech distill as the dew, as raindrops on the tender grass or tender herb, and as showers on the grass. So he's painting a picture of basically saying, pay close attention to what I'm about to say.
We'll look at Deuteronomy 4:6. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. So he's using them as witnesses to their behavior.
Yeah, it's almost as if those kind of verses, it's almost as if God stops and says, I want my entire creation to pay attention to me right now.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
have something very important to say.
Yes. Yeah. Mhm.
And that's what this chapter kind of does. So in verse 3 and 4, I proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God, for he is the rock, which God as rock is used 5 times in this one chapter.
Mhm.
So the idea of what? Foundation, solid, protection, um, everything that a rock represents in the Bible. Of course, Christ is the rock. And so many ways that rock is used in positive ways in the Bible,
Mhm.
5 times in this one chapter. For all his ways are justice, a God of truth and without injustice. Righteous and upright is he. So ascribing greatness to God. So it's kind of like the model prayer. Jesus taught them the model prayer.
Mhm.
He started out by saying, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Mhm. Yeah.
Start out by ascribing greatness to God.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's a good way to start our prayers. I often start my prayers asking for forgiveness, thinking I need to get that taken care of first, wipe the slate clean so
Yeah.
I can focus on other things. But actually, the Bible seems to teach that our prayers would best be started with ascribing greatness to God, recognizing who you're talking to, honoring him, lifting him up
Mhm.
is a really good way to start our prayers.
Mhm.
Verse 5, they've corrupted themselves. It's almost, a lot of times the Bible speaks in past tense as if it had already happened, even though it hadn't maybe happened yet,
Right. Right.
because he knows it's going to happen.
Mhm.
They have corrupted themselves. They are not his children because of their blemish, a perverse and crooked generation.
Mhm.
This idea of
Wow.
being God's children, it's an interesting, the idea of God as our Father is used often in the New Testament,
Mhm.
but surprisingly rare in the Old Testament.
Right. Right.
I think I counted one time that he's only referred to as our Father about 15 times.
Mm.
About half of those times he refers to himself as their Father.
Mm.
So maybe only about 7 or 8 times someone calls him, our Father, or addresses him as Father. So something that is so uncommon in the Old Testament, and we normally think of the God of the Old Testament as the father figure,
Mhm.
but he's not referred to as the father figure as often as most people would think,
Mhm.
but he is in the New Testament.
Mhm.
I mean, he's used more than 15 times. I'm pretty sure I counted one time. So I think I'm right in this. At least around the same amount as 12 to 15 times just in the Sermon on the Mount as it is in all of the Old Testament. So kind of different than you might think. Then he says, I want to notice the progression in verse 6. By the way, at the end of verse 5, a perverse and crooked generation was kind of their, as we used the word last session, inclination. This was their inclination all through their history. Hardly ever were they, maybe never completely, but hardly ever even approaching the desire of God for them to be a holy nation as a nation.
Right.
They rarely got close to that. Do you thus deal with the Lord, O foolish and unwise people? He is not your father. Is he not your father? So this is one of the very first times the Old Testament mentions him as father. Who bought you? Has he not made you and established you? So I like this progression of thought: bought, made, established. And then there's something really interesting. Maybe you have a thought on this. There's something deeper here than what we might normally think. Verses 7 through 9. Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, he will show you, your elders, they will tell you. When the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. Now, what do you, there's something about the destiny of the nations are closely bound up with Israel. He's connecting the destiny of the nations, but even more than just the nation of Israel, according to the number of the children of Israel. We've, now, when we think of the nations leading up to the millennial, we'd have to think about the application of this there. The dividing of the nations after the Tower of Babel, does that play into this? But then you've brought up several times, and this is something I think more of us need to develop. This is one reason why you're so big on the three destiny idea, is that you came to the conclusion that God's elective purpose must include the saved of the nations. Not part of the bride, but not in hell. And that they serve a very important purpose in God's elective plan. So that's why you have what you call the three destinies that most do not accept. Most do not. Most have a two destiny. The Protestants have a two destiny. You're either saved or lost. Some we know what we call the extreme hyper covenant people have a two destiny. You're either in the bride or you're in hell.
They used to believe in three, but now they believe in two. So they changed their theology.
So this idea here is often overlooked. And I think if a serious study was made all through the Old Testament, it becomes clear that God has an elective purpose for his children who are not part of the bride. And it is a necessary and important part of his plan that is often overlooked. And so that's why I say the majority, because two different ways of looking at it. The Protestants look at either lost or saved. Others look at either bride or lost in hell or whatever. But just two. There are only two distinct futures, and you have discovered and become convinced that that third group is just as important in God's plan.
Mhm. Mhm.
So,
And for the simple reason that if you're going to have a ruling class of people, you have to have someone that they rule over who didn't qualify as the ruling class, there and therefore need to be ruled over. And so when Luke says, according to the parable, be ruler over 5 cities or be ruler over 10 cities, that's, to me, that's what he's saying here. The rulers will rule over the cities of the nations. And so the surrounding area right now, of course, is all Muslim. All that's going to change when Jesus returns. That the geographic people are going to be changed over there. They're going to be displaced.
I know even some missionary Baptists who hold to our view of the bride, you need to be faithful to be part of the bride. It's not for all the saved. But who also find that term three destiny offensive, because in their mind, you are downplaying the role of salvation too much. You're almost like you're saying it's not that important. But it is quite important. The bride can only be drawn from those who already are saved.
Right.
And so that has to be a necessary ingredient to it. But that the distinction within the children of God, between those who are in the bride and those who are not, is distinct enough as to call it 2 different destinies. It's not downplaying the importance of initial salvation, but it's saying that the bride is something so distinct that it needs to be looked at as a third destiny.
Well, Jesus framed it as those who are least in the kingdom and those who are great in the kingdom. So
He did make that distinction, didn't he?
Yeah. The third group, of course, then would be those who aren't in the kingdom. They're in the lake of fire. So there's your third destiny.
So there's an entrance into the kingdom and there's an inheriting the kingdom.
Yes.
So there's a number of different ways the New Testament distinguishes that. But, you know, even many honest Protestants are honest enough in their Bible study. I've heard a number of them say that there is a large distinction in rewards, they call it. So that some will receive many rewards and some very few or no rewards. They don't really call it bride and not bride, saved. They still put everyone in the bride, but they make such a distinction of those who receive many rewards and those who receive little or none. That's basically admitting that the distinction is quite large.
Well, I'd like our viewers to just think about that for just a moment. Because the scene of the people you just mentioned is in heaven. So in their minds, all this is going to be in heaven. So the rewards are going to be in heaven. In their mind, it's going to be in heaven. Now, ask our viewers to think along for just a moment. Picture the saved up in heaven. What would constitute a reward? If everyone's up in heaven, what would the reward be? What would constitute more reward than others? And so if I'm up in heaven and I'm rewarded more than the next guy, what does that reward look like? How is it a reward? What does that, give me an imagery of what that reward would look like. Do I get more coins in my coffer? Do I get more crowns on my head? And what would be the purpose for the reward? If everyone is up in heaven, because there's no division or distinction in heaven. But now if you transfer all of that down on the earth, you can see clearly and easily the division of nations, cities. You can see easily the reward is the inheritance, where one would rule over this amount of cities, that part of the earth. Others would rule over other areas, more and less. And so that's once you bring things back down on the earth, it really gives you a strong imagery of what Jesus.
And that's why it's so important to bring it back to the earth.
Yeah.
Our destiny is on the earth. We were made from the earth. God
Yes.
made us to dwell on the earth in physical bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole purpose of the resurrection is to give us a physical body
Yeah.
to dwell on the earth. If
Yes.
we remain
Yes.
spirits, then we could just stay in heaven.
Yeah.
But we have physicality, we have locality,
Mm-hmm.
and that is best brought about on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So that once you get the idea that the kingdom is, heaven's going to come to earth, basically, the kingdom is going to be on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So then it brings it back down to language of like, how did Israel operate? Mm-hmm. How does the church operate?
Mm-hmm.
Both of those have distinctions of responsibilities within the government operation of those two institutions. Mm-hmm. And so you have a king, and then you have the citizens. You have a prophet. You have a priest. You have, and 1 Corinthians 12 talks about all those distinctions within the church. Mm-hmm. And so that same principle is brought into the kingdom on the earth, mm-hmm. with an operational government conducting affairs on the earth, so that this idea of levels of responsibility must come into play. There cannot be an equality of experience once you bring it all down to the earth.
Right.
Yeah, and so that's exactly what you were talking about.
And then, of course, you include the territory or the boundaries. Every kingdom has its boundary lines. Mm-hmm. Our boundary line in America, the southern boundary is increasing. We're now taking in Mexico and all the central. But that's a whole nother. Braden, we'll save that for another episode.
So maybe our readers have really researched this more completely about how it's kind of cryptic language in some ways, almost a mystery quality to it. How that he set the boundaries of the peoples, the nations, the Gentiles, the pagans, according to the number of the children of Israel. I haven't quite worked out maybe exactly what that might mean. But there's some depth there that we haven't plumbed yet.
Does it seem like it's suggesting a ratio?
It does suggest a ratio, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Well, for the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the place of his inheritance. He found him in a desert land, and in the wasteland, a howling wilderness. He encircled him. He instructed him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. Now, this is a great verse to show what I was talking about, this chapter being the fountainhead or the headwaters of so much of later prophetic language borrowed from this chapter. In this verse 10 is very much like the language of Ezekiel 16, the first 14 verses, that famous passage over there where he talks about in the day of your birth, on your nativity, the day you were born, your navel cord was not cut, nor were you washed in water to cleanse you, not rubbed with salt, wrapped in swaddling clothes. No eye pitied you. When I passed by you, I saw you struggling in your blood. I said to you in your blood, live. I made you thrive like a plant. You grew, matured, became very beautiful. When I passed by you again, I looked upon you, the time of your love. I spread my wings over you, covered your nakedness, swore an oath to you. You became mine. So then it becomes not just birth language, but marriage language. And it goes on to talk about the not just the garments, but the whole outfit, you might say, that the jewelry and everything of the bride, the ornaments, jewels, what she was clothed with in verse 13, her splendor in verse 14. So he's talking about the whole history of Israel, but he's talking about the idea of the whole history of a person who was born and needing help, not able to survive, and then ends up being a bride. Mm-hmm. That whole language is kind of just a larger or more detailed development of Deuteronomy 32:10.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the later prophets really, I think, were triggered or inspired by much of what we say Moses wrote, but he only wrote what God told him to write. So this beautiful prophetic song in Deuteronomy 32 becomes a foundation, what would you call it, a supply source for the later prophets to draw from and expand on.
Mm-hmm. You know, I was thinking, Brother Rick, in that Ezekiel passage, the picture of God's elect people and how that they weren't respected in any way. Okay, they were looked down upon until, you know, God was seeing them as his beloved, but everyone else was disrespecting them or neglecting them. And I'm thinking of the early history. You think of Abraham there in his homeland, and how that they were just worshiping, you know, moon gods, and God pulled him out of it. But then he goes down into Egypt, and the king there didn't respect him. In other words, he didn't stand out per se as deserving of any real respect. And then we get to Jacob, and Laban disrespected him by trying to cheat him in his wages. So all along the way in the development of this kingdom people, covenant people, they weren't earning or getting the respect from the other people around them.
Right.
And then, but God saw what he wanted to do with and for these people. And so he cleaned them up, washed them up, and made something of them, even though they didn't appreciate it.
Yeah. So like you said, the root of that started with Ishmael mocking Isaac.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
That mockery, yes. Well, it wasn't just a mockery of Isaac. It was deeper than that. It was a mockery of God's right to choose who his elect would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what the mockery, that's why Psalm 2 is so important. Why do the nations rage?
Mm-hmm.
They plot against him and his anointed,
mm-hmm.
his selection, his election.
Yeah.
That's what they're really mocking against. Mm-hmm. The nations over in the Middle East are not, why do they hate Israel? Well, they may not recognize it. They hate Israel because God chose Israel,
that's right.
Not them.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Because that's what they're really fighting against.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ishmael's mockery against Isaac set the tone mm-hmm. for what has happened all through history and still going on today in our time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And another example of the later prophets borrowing from this chapter is verse 11 and 12. As an eagle stirs up its nest, hovers over its young. Boy, that's almost like Genesis 1:2. The spirit hovered or moved, brooded over the face of the deep to bring forth life. Hovers over its young, spreading out its wings, taking them up, carrying them on its wings. So the Lord alone led him, and there was no foreign God with him. And to me, it's very reminiscent of what Hosea said. Actually, God is talking about Israel. And Hosea 11, it's the one that starts out, when Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt, I called my son. But it says in verse 3, I taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I drew them with gentle cords, with bands of love. And I was to them as those who take the yoke from their neck. I stooped and fed them. It's kind of like an expansion of verse 11 here in Deuteronomy 32. So again, just trying to show this, how they're all reading Moses, reading this song given to Moses by God, and expanding on it in their own writings. Now, verse 13 and 14 kind of takes a little bit of a turn. He starts speaking about their future as if it's present. He made them ride on the heights of the earth, that he might eat the produce of the fields. He made them to draw honey from the rock and oil from the flinty rock, curds from the cattle, milk of the flock with fat of lambs, the rams of the breed of Bashan, and goats, the choicest wheat. And you drink wine and blood of their grapes. So this is their high calling. This is what God desired for them, is to enjoy all these kinds of blessings that they never quite enjoyed fully. but they will enjoy fully in the millennium.
Yes.
So a lot of this starts taking on a very prophetic aspect to it. In verse 15, but Jeshurun, Jeshurun, you might say, is a poetic, loving nickname of God to them. It means dear, upright people. Now, they weren't very dear and upright, in fact, but that's how God wanted to look at them. He loved them.
Mm-hmm.
He was wanting to enter a marriage relationship with them. So he had this like pet name, we use honey or dear, sweetie.
Right.
That's kind of God's way of this loving nickname.
Mm-hmm.
But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat and grew thick. You are covered with fat. Then he forsook God who made him and scornfully esteemed the rock of his salvation. They provoked him to jealousy with foreign gods. With abominations, they provoked him to anger. Well, they're not even in the land yet.
Right. Right.
So how could this all be true of them?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe in bits and pieces they had already violated some of this description, but this is really still talking about their entire future history of what is going to happen to them. But he speaks of it as if it had already happened because he could, he could see the future so clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a prophetic truth. All the way down through verse 18, they sacrificed to demons, verse 17, not to God, to gods they did not know, to new gods, new arrivals that your fathers did not fear. Of the rock who begot you, you are unmindful and have forgotten the God who fathered you. Well, again, maybe to a degree they'd already violated this or done this description, but this is kind of a prophetic truth of their future, and it's going to remain this way basically until Zechariah 12:10, when they look on him whom they pierced and they repent.
Mm-hmm.
Or like Daniel 12, verse 7 says that, let me get the exact wording of it, about what they need to come to before this being a crooked and perverse generation is out of their system. Mm-hmm. He says, 12:7, the end of it, and when the power of the holy people has been completely, I think the Old King James says scattered, but most of the modern translations say shattered. You're scattered because you're shattered. Mm-hmm. But the idea is that when their power is completely broken, then all these things shall be finished. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we support Israel today. We know they're still in unbelief. We know that Tel Aviv and Haifa and those kind of northern cities are some of the most wicked, ungodly cities on the earth. Mm-hmm. We understand all that. And we're not saying they do everything right. Mm-hmm. They're operating in their own strength. So they're probably doing a lot of things wrong. Yeah. But God still has a plan for them. And he's waiting until their strength is completely shattered. Mm-hmm. When they no longer rely on the arm of their own strength, on their own wisdom, on their own ingenuity, when they are on the verge of being destroyed, mm-hmm. and they realize that no one is there to help them and they cannot any longer help themselves. Mm-hmm. That's when God steps in and says, okay, now you're ready to be my people.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why I say, when shall all Israel be saved? When they come to the same place that every lost person comes to. I'm helpless. I can no longer save myself. I can't do anything to get myself out of this. I've got to just totally surrender, mm-hmm. put my faith in the Lord. And that's when he steps in, saves us, and forgives us.
Yes.
Well, the whole nation needs to come to that place.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that won't happen until the return of their Messiah. Mm-hmm. Verse 19 and 20, when the Lord saw it, he spurned them because of the provocation of his sons and his daughters. And he said, I will hide my face from them. This is one of the early uses of this phrase that the later prophets really pick up on often, the idea of God hiding his face from them, withholding blessings, dishing out punishment and judgment. I will see what their end will be, for they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faith. They're still children. They're still his people, but they lacked faith. That, Hebrews 3 and 4 talks a lot about that, doesn't it? It compares the generation that died in the wilderness. The Hebrew writer is warning Jewish Christians of his day, don't be like that. But it tells me that God's people can be like that. And he will hide his face from us just as well. They have provoked me to jealousy by what is not God. They have moved me to anger by their foolish idols. But I will provoke them to jealousy by those who are not a nation. Boy, there's a deep prophetic statement right there.
Right.
I mean, how often does Paul get into this? Romans 9 through 11. And later in the later prophets, they talk about this, that God's purpose in bringing in the Gentiles into the olive tree without them having to go through the proselyte laws of the Mosaic system. And that, so the Jews always had an understanding that the Gentiles were going to be brought in, but they thought they would be brought in like Ruth was brought in, that they have to become part of the literal nation of Israel and submit to all of their laws. They did not understand how that God in his wisdom had already formulated a way by the institution of the church to bring that about in a way that the Jews did not expect. And that even Jewish church people in the beginning fought against it because they didn't quite understand it yet.
Yeah.
And that part of the purpose of the day of Pentecost, the gift of tongues, the purpose of the church in general, even though it's been 2,000 years, is to provoke Israel to jealousy. I think my personal belief is that the church will go through the tribulation and the church will be refined and purified and graced to such a degree that the Jews will look at what the church is going through in her persecution and her strong faith, and they will recognize these really are the people of God, and it will provoke them to jealousy. And part of what will trigger their conversion is this jealousy that is provoked when they see that the true people of God are from all the nations who walk by faith as part of the Lord's ecclesia, and we've missed it all these years, and now we want what they have. The Jews were so high-minded that they thought all the Gentiles want what they have because Israel is the elect of God. God says, I need to get rid of that pride in you. And so I'm going to bring the Gentiles into this olive tree in a different way than you thought. And at the end, the Jews are going to look at the church, I think, as the true people of God and be provoked to jealousy. So this is a really, really important verse. I will provoke them to jealousy by those who are not a nation. I will move them to anger by a foolish nation. And, to the Jews, all the Gentiles were foolish nations, ungodly, pagan. And those are the kind of people that God reached through the gospel, through the setting up of his church and so forth, covenant relationship, to make them equal members of that olive tree.
You know, Brother Rick, if God had cast off Israel, like so many want to have us believe, and all he was concerned about now was the Gentile, then why would God go to the length of wanting to make Israel jealous
That's a good point.
if he had written them off?
Yeah, he designed it purposely to make them jealous,
Yes.
and jealous to the point of repentance,
Yes.
not jealous to the point of anger and rejection of God,
Right.
but jealous to the point of touching their hearts and changing their hearts.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's a good point, Mike. He would not have designed it to produce jealousy if he was through with them.
Right.
Yeah. Verse 22, for a fire is kindled in my anger, shall burn to the lowest hell. It shall consume the earth with their increase, set on fire the foundation of the mountains. That's a language of Christ's return and God's wrath. You know, 2 Peter 3, 2 Thessalonians 1 talks about the fire of his wrath and his judgment on those who do not know him and his rescue of his people. And then you have in verse 23 through 27 what I call language of Matthew 24. So in verse 23, I will heap disasters upon them. I will spin my arrows upon them. They shall be wasted with hunger, devoured by pestilence, bitter destruction. It's almost like you're reading Matthew 24.
Mm-hmm.
I will also send against them the teeth of beasts, with the poison of serpents of the dust. The sword shall destroy outside. So the end of verse 24 is almost like some of those weird creatures in the book of Revelation that come up out of the pit. The sword will destroy outside. There shall be terror within. There's that outside and inside, isn't there? Interesting.
Yeah.
So you're going to have danger from without, and you're going to have terror from within. And, Daniel 11 talks about during that time that many shall join them by intrigue for the purpose of spying on them and turning them in and, doing them a lot of harm from within.
Paul talked about the same thing, dangers from the country and dangers from the city.
He called it perils.
Perils, yes.
Perils. Because I remember I attended an ordination service one time, and the man elected to preach read that passage in 2 Corinthians and said, I'm going to preach on the perils of the ministry. He said, I don't mean pearls, I mean perils.
Perils.
So he approached it from a negative standpoint of all that you're going to have to deal with and try to overcome by God's grace. But it was a powerful sermon too. It really was a good one. And then it says at the end of verse 25, for the young man and virgin, the nursing child with the man of gray hairs, I would have said, I will dash them in pieces. I will make the memory of them to cease from among men. Had I not feared the wrath of the enemy, lest their adversary should misunderstand, lest they should say, our hand is high, and it is not the Lord who has done all this. And just language of Matthew 24, Revelation, Luke 21, Mark 13. It's kind of all through these verses. And then it says in, I have a little note here at the end of verse 27, lest they should say, our hand is high, and it is not the Lord who has done all this. I have a note that says this will be exactly the attitude of Antichrist and his confederation about Israel.
Yeah.
So that's true, isn't it? They won't attribute any of it to God, God's judgment on Israel or God's judgment on them. They won't attribute anything that's going on to God.
But we look at Pharaoh. He said, see, they are shut up entrapped in the wilderness. And so the Antichrist will see them out in the
Good
Negev
point.
and go after them. They're trapped.
Yeah. Good point. Good comparison. Verse 28, for they are a nation void of counsel, nor is there any understanding in them, and still describes them today in their relationship with God.
Mhm.
You know, I read of many. It seems like if you believed all of them, I don't mean to put any of them down. There's a lot of ministries over Christian ministries over in Israel trying to witness and convert the Jews to Christ. And I appreciate their efforts, I guess. And there's just a lot of them. But, you know, if you believed all of them, the whole nation of Israel would be saved by now, you know, because they're having so much success, according to them.
Right.
Whatever success they are having is very minor, still a very small percentage.
Mhm.
And verse 28 still describes them as a nation. They're void of counsel, nor is there any understanding in them. Here's an ongoing lament of God toward his people Israel. Verse 29, oh, that they were wise, that they would understand this, that they would consider their latter end.
Mm.
So even before bringing them into Canaan land to possess and inherit, he's talking this about them, that they're not considering their latter end. And this is, I guess we could say, this is the heart of all of our sermons, because it applies to lost people, it applies to wayward children of God, it applies to half-hearted people of God in their service to him. It applies to all of us, that we really don't consider our latter end enough.
Mm-hmm.
We just really don't.
Mm-hmm.
We say we do, but we live as if we don't. If we really considered our latter end, it would affect everything we say and do every day.
It would.
So we betray ourselves by our actions and speech. We say we're wanting to be in the bride, or we say we want to inherit the kingdom, or we say we want to be with Christ forever. And part of us really believes it. But in truth, we often live as if we're not considering our latter end. Verse 30, how could one chase 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight, lest the rock had sold them, unless the Lord had surrendered them? And we brought this up before. This is kind of a what could have been statement. This could have been true their entire history.
Yeah.
That the Lord was willing to fight for them, deliver them, have them be the head of the nations. But because of verse 29, 28 and 29, verse 30 could not be an ongoing experience. It was a pretty rare experience.
Well, similar to Psalm 81:14, I just looked it up. I'll read it in the New King James. Psalm 81:14.
Yeah, I have that marked in my Bible. I actually have the words, what could have been.
Yes. Yeah. I know you've mentioned this verse before in previous episodes.
Go ahead and read it, Mike.
Yeah. So Psalm 81:14, I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their adversaries. The haters of the Lord would pretend submission to him, but their fate would endure forever. He would have fed them also with the finest of wheat, and with honey from the rock I would have satisfied you.
So is that a true statement or not?
Yes.
You know, we say, well, you know, Christ had to die and Israel had to reject him and the church had to start and all these things. But the language of the Old Testament is that God never wanted to cast them away.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to bless them all the way through and deliver them and be their savior and their king. There's another passage like this in Isaiah 48. verse 18 and 19. If you wouldn't mind reading that.
Isaiah 48:18.
18 and 19. It says it just as direct as Psalm does.
Oh, that you had heeded my commandments. Then your peace would have been like a river, and your righteousness like the waves of the sea. Your descendants also would have been like the sand, and the offspring of your body like the grains of sand. His name would not have been cut off nor destroyed from before me.
So would have been is used a couple of times in it. That's what
Yes.
would have been.
Yes, what would have been?
But because of your unbelief, I mean, if you'd been true to my name, your name would not have been cut off nor destroyed from before me. So what could have been? Verse 31, back in Deuteronomy 32, for the rock is not like our rock, even our enemies themselves being judges. And that, one of the enemies that judged their rock was not like our rock was Rahab. That's one reason why she was rescued. She says,
Yeah,
we've seen what your God did. I believe that your God is the true God. She exhibited her faith in the true God of Israel, and she was rescued and brought into the bloodline of Christ. So this could have been the testimony of their enemies all through their history. Their rock is not like our rock. Our enemies themselves being judges. For their vine is the vine of Sodom, the fields of Gomorrah, their grapes are grapes of gall, their clusters are bitter, their wine is the poison of serpents, and the cruel venom of cobras. I wonder if John the Baptist had this passage in mind. They called them a den of vipers. Den of vipers. So they were to be God's people. Instead, they became a den of vipers, of cobras, serpents. Pretty strong language.
Yes, yeah.
Verse 34 is a real beautiful verse. So all of this that he'd been talking about had to sound very, very strange to the Jews about ready to cross the Jordan and possess the land. Of all this negative prophetic language about their future. Just didn't seem possible at that point. So he says in verse 34, is this not laid up in store with me, sealed up among my treasures? That's the language of mystery, isn't it? This is mystery.
Yeah.
The rest of the Old Testament into the New Testament will go on to describe how this mystery is revealed, is unfolded. It might seem like a mystery right now that you're entering the promised land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But this part of the song just finished already is describing a different future. And it seems very mysterious. But it's laid up in store with me, and I will reveal it at the right time to the right people. And so mystery, often used in the Old Testament, speaks of a concealed truth with the intentions of revealing that truth to the right people at the right time.
Yes, yes.
So it involves concealment and revelation. But sealed up among my treasure, among my treasures. Vengeance is mine and recompense. Their feet shall slip in due time. For the day of their calamity is at hand, and the things to come hasten upon them. The day of calamity, the day of calamity, the time of Jacob's trouble, the great tribulation.
Right.
All of this is speaking about the day of God's judgment. And I often like to refer to this verse. Often those who teach the imminent return of Christ, always connected with the pre-tribulation rapture, that he could return any moment in the air and rapture his people to heaven for 7 years, which we both deny that the Bible teaches. And often the imminent idea depends on the many uses in the New Testament that speaks about those events as at hand or near.
Mm-hmm.
And so they build this big case that the terminology at hand or near must imply imminence,
Mm-hmm.
must imply imminence. But you go back to verses like this, and later in some of the prophet books, Joel does this, where it speaks about events that are clearly 2,500, 3,000, in this case, 3,500 years into the future, the day of their calamity. And it describes it as at hand. So it's a term that is intended to produce urgency to faith and repentance and getting yourself ready more than the idea of imminence.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus said when he came, the king, and John preached this, the kingdom is at hand. Well, but we know the kingdom in its fullness
Mm-hmm.
is not going to be for till the millennial.
Mm-hmm.
But 2,000 years ago, they said it was at hand.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be really careful about insisting that terminology you must conclude imminence.
Mm-hmm.
Much of the prophetic language uses this idea of at hand or near, and yet it's clearly talking about events in the distant future. In verse 36, I quoted earlier Daniel 12:7, that when the power of the holy people is shattered, then all these things shall come to pass. And this is where that is drawn from. Here's where it really begins, the fountainhead of it.
Mm-hmm.
For the Lord will judge his people and have compassion on his servants when he sees that their power is gone. That is the only way that all Israel will be saved,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is when their power is gone, when the power of the holy people is completely shattered.
Mm-hmm.
There is, and I compare that to, Jacob wrestling with the angel all night. And he touched the socket of his hip. And basically, I don't know if you've ever wrestled like in high school or anything. I did for 1 year.
Oh, we
I
did,
quit.
yeah.
I didn't do it any other years because it's the hardest sport I ever did. That third round, you are completely empty. It takes all you have. And Jacob had to reach the end of his strength before his name was changed to Israel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When did he overcome? When his strength was gone. It's just the opposite of the way the world looks at it. It's when our strength is totally gone. It's like Romans 5, for when we were without strength, Christ died for the ungodly. And so it's this lack of dependence on self. It's total elimination of pride and self-sufficiency,
Mm-hmm.
total dependence on him, surrender, humble faith, that his blessing comes. And this is a pretty powerful verse about what it's going to take before Israel becomes a holy nation,
Mm-hmm.
when he sees that their power is gone. So sometime toward the end of the 7 years, when 2/3 of them are wiped out, 1/3 of them is protected in the wilderness,
Mm-hmm.
and through the witness of the church, he provokes them to jealousy. They reach a place where they freely admit our power is gone.
Mm-hmm.
We are helpless.
Mm-hmm.
So at that moment, he steps in, and only he knows when that moment is reached.
Right. Yeah.
But it has to be completely gone. Pretty powerful verse there.
Mm-hmm.
37, he will say, where are their gods, the rock in which they sought refuge, who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offering? Let them rise and help you and be your refuge. You know, that's kind of like Elijah and the prophets of Baal, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Where's your God? Let him come. Let
Mm-hmm.
him come help you today.
You know, I'm thinking, Brother Rick, while you're bringing out these points, I'm now wondering. I can't think of a verse. I'm wondering now that when Israel was at the Red Sea and Pharaoh and his armies are in hot pursuit, and they realize the trouble that they're in, did they reach this helpless state, or was it more just out of fear and panic? And Moses had to say to them, "Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord." Maybe that hadn't reached their hearts yet.
Yeah, their fear had to be turned into complete helplessness.
Yes, and I think they maybe brought that spirit of fear, but not respect, not submission, over on the other side of the Red Sea, and they still battled it, and hence wanting to go back to Egypt, the golden calf. There was still this spirit of rebelliousness still in them, because maybe they hadn't reached that climax of humility on the other side of the sea.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, and I think it's a really good, that you showed several maps or pictures of what it looked like on that little flat area with the mountains kind of behind them and a kind of a narrow pathway that they came through to reach that beachhead just before they crossed the Red Sea.
Mm-hmm.
And so the armies of Egypt, and there's mountains and there's water in front of them, and they were completely helpless to do anything at all at that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's when the salvation came.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Gary J. Browning is teaching the life of David in our adult Sunday school class, and he showed a map Sunday. If you can find it, or maybe I'll ask him to send it to you. It looked almost exactly like your map of Israel trapped at the Red Sea with the armies of Egypt coming behind them and no other escape route. Of when David was on the run from Saul, and he went down to En Gedi, down at the edge of the Dead Sea, and he had just come through what was called the rocks of the wild goats. So in other words, a set of real steep, sharp, difficult mountains, and then out to this little flat area. Gary showed it on his picture. Kind of a little oasis area right at the Dead Sea. So you have the Dead Sea and all it represents. You have the rocks of the wild goats behind you, and then you have Saul's army coming towards you. And I made mention to Gary that, and he kind of agreed with me, that God was letting David experience what the nation had experienced back at the Red Sea.
Israel in miniature.
It almost looked like the same exact picture, just in a different location, but the setting looked exactly the same. And it just really jumped out at me because I remembered that picture you had shown, so graphic. God was letting David experience what the nation had experienced, because God likes to repeat those kind of themes over and over, doesn't he?
Yeah. In case you missed it, we'll run it by you again.
Verse 39, now see that I've started circling, because a lot in the prophets, again, when God really wants to kind of emphasize something, he uses this little phrase, even I. You'd be surprised how often it's used in the prophet books. Am he, and there is no God besides me. I kill and I make alive. So he's establishing his sovereignty, his power. I wound and I heal. nor is there any who can deliver from my hand. For I lift my hand to heaven and say, as I live forever, if I whet my glittering sword. Boy, there's Revelation 19 right there.
Oh, wow.
And my hand takes hold on judgment, I will render vengeance to my enemies and repay those who hate me. And I will make my arrows drunk with blood. There's the blood to the horse's bridle.
Mm.
There's the Isaiah 63, is it? Why are you coming from Bozrah with your garments dyed red in blood? Because he's conquering his enemies. My sword shall devour flesh with the blood of the slain and the captives. And then here's a real interesting, I think this might be one of the very first after Genesis 3:15, kind of a veiled reference here to the Antichrist, because this is an entire return of Christ setting language here from the heads of the leaders of the enemy. Well, that's what Antichrist is. He's the head of the leaders of the enemy.
Yeah.
So this might be where the whole idea of, you have the death wound to the head. He's the leader of the enemy. He is the enemy. And it's all within the context of Christ coming to slay his enemies, shed their blood. So this might be kind of a veiled reference to what later is developed as the Antichrist. And then it ends with what I call a wonderful but dark song. Ends with the promise of destruction of his enemies and the atonement of Israel. Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people. He will avenge the blood of his servants and render vengeance to his adversaries. He will provide atonement for his land and his people. So as dark as this song is, it ends with hope and redemption for these people. But it's not going to, the atonement for his land and his people, that Ezekiel and other of the prophets talks about burying all the dead bodies for 7 months and all the other things they're going to have to do at that time. And it describes it as to cleanse the land.
Yeah.
And here it says he's going to provide atonement for his land and his people.
That's important because in times ahead then, when they would look back and read Deuteronomy, after a lot of this had come to pass and ended up being true, here in verse 43, there's also that promise stamped at the end of this. And so no matter how bad things would get, in the middle of it, and they're thinking to themselves, you know what, everything that Moses foretold is coming to pass, or it has come to pass. But oh wait, look at this. There's the promise of an atonement. So they would have that to cling to as well. So if the first part came true, the second part would also come true.
That's good. Now, this last statement, the way this song ends, it might be where that famous statement in John 1:11 is drawn from. And we've quoted quite a bit, but when you look into the original language of that statement, he came into his own, and his own received him not. But that first use of his own is said to be indicating a place. He came into his own place. It's not talking about people there so much. He came to his own place, and in that place, his own people received him not. And I think there's something there in John 11 that ties in with this, because all through the Old Testament, there's this continual tie-in to the place and the people, the land and the people. And so John 1:11 seems to be saying something like, And I think a lot of, in fact, my New King James does have a center column footnote that says that first he came to his own could mean his own things. It's more neuter idea, not masculine. He came into his own things or place, and then his own people did not receive him. So we kind of miss that the way it's translated. It seems like it's equating the same thing in both statements, but it may have a broader meaning of he came to his own place or land, and his own people of that land did not receive him. And it may be drawn from this conclusion because God wanted this to be a song that spoke about their entire history and future. Part of that was their Messiah coming the first time, we might say, truthfully, I think, he came the first time to provide atonement for his land and people, but his own received him not. So the atonement was paid, or blood was shed, the redemption and so forth, at his first coming. So that's when the atonement was provided. But because of their rejection, it won't have its desired effect, at least on the land and the people of Israel, until his second coming.
Well, he was coming to that place whereupon his father had already placed his name, and that was Jerusalem. So he came to that whole people and that whole land, the promised land, to emphasize his father and his father's name, to come in his father's name, because that's where the father had placed his name.
Let me see, there's another verse.
And that was verse 43, right, that you were referring to?
Yeah, 43, yeah.
Okay.
That's the conclusion to the song. And what a song. What a song. Very prophetic, very dark in many ways. But it's so often in the later prophet books, you're reading through it and it's talking about the judgment on Jerusalem, the judgment on Israel for their rejection, all that. But in so many of those chapters, it ends the same way, with hope.
Yes.
Redemption and rescue. And so again, it's almost like they're following the pattern of Moses in this song, of ending on a high note. He will provide atonement for his land and his people.
Well, Israel in that regard is like a cat. You throw a cat out of a second floor window and he'll always land on his feet. So no matter how bad the picture is painted, God will have Israel landing on her feet in the very end as the chief of nations.
Yes, he will. So if we read down through verse 47, so Moses came with Joshua, the son of Nun, and spoke all the words of this song in the hearing of the people. Moses finished speaking all these words to all Israel, and he said to them, "Set your hearts on all the words which I testify among you today, which you shall command your children to be careful to observe all the words of this law. For it is not a futile thing for you, or a vain thing, because it is your life." It's kind of like that old TV show, This Is Your Life.
Yes, right.
It could kind of have that meaning. I'm describing your entire existence as a people here in this song, because it is your life, and by this word you shall prolong your days in the land. That's a problem. They couldn't keep the land because they couldn't keep their commitment to God. And they're both tied together. And when they rejected God in the Old Testament, or when Jesus came, they rejected him. That package, that union of the people and the land had to be broken also. It was broken by them, and so God would remove them from the land because it was to be a package deal. And if they would not be a holy nation. They couldn't have a holy land, but they will in the millennial, which you cross over the Jordan to possess. So that closes out a wonderful, it's just interesting. I think I mentioned this last week. At the beginning of his ministry with them as their leader, once they crossed the Red Sea, and then at the end of his life. So 40-year period started with a song in Exodus 15, and it closes with the song here in Deuteronomy 32. So our 100th session will be to close out the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 33, which is chapter 33 is kind of like the Genesis 49, where Jacob blessed the 12 sons and pronounced blessings on them prophetically even. Moses does the same thing here in chapter 33. So that's kind of interesting.
Yes, yes.
And then chapter 34 to close out. So there's still some good things. We went a little long today, but there was a lot in this chapter.
You know, you mentioned the tie between the people and the land. They're inseparable as far as God is concerned, because Adam was taken from the land. So Adam was formed from the earth, components, elements of the earth. And so there's a inseparable tie with man and land. And so you've got to cleanse the land. If you're going to prepare a holy people, then the land has to be restored to that holiness as well. And if you're going to restore the land to holiness, you're going to have to populate it with a holy people. So it's inseparable, this whole plan of God.
And that's kind of a miniature of his larger desire for the whole world and people. Is the millennial is going to remove the curses and bring blessings on the whole earth and on the peoples of the earth. But what his desire for Israel is in some way his desire for the whole human race, because that's the way it started with Adam, as you said.
Yeah.
Tied to the earth.
Yeah.
And our future is tied to the earth.
Yeah. Yeah. And the fountainhead, you mentioned fountainhead, the fountainhead of this holiness that will roll over across the whole earth is in Jerusalem. That's the fountainhead of all this holiness.
The city of the great king,
Yes.
Psalm 48:2.
Yes. Yeah. Beulah land.
Yep. Beulah land, I will marry the land.
Yes. Yeah.
The land is as much part of the marriage contract as the people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So inseparable. Thank you for your input today, Mike. And
good study. I'll tell you what.
I always enjoyed Deuteronomy 32. I hope we brought out enough that it became evident of why we call it the fountainhead of later prophecy. It's like a treasure chest that the later prophets kept drawing precious jewels out of for their own writings.
Yes. And I can hardly wait for your next book, The Pivotal Chapters of the Old and the New Testament. I can hardly wait. How about you, viewers? Can you hardly wait too?
How many copies do you think I'll sell? Do you think it'll ever be a positive cash flow? You go on some of these religious channels and,
right.
You realize, man, some of these men write a book every year and they're probably, that's the main source of their income,
You mean like Dreams of My Father?
There probably no house in the entire country has it in their library, but.
Right. Yeah. Well, good session today. Good session. So,
well, let me see. So we don't have next week. That's the second Wednesday.
Yeah.
So we will save our 100th session for a couple of weeks from now.
August 21st.
Okay. That sounds like a good day to have number 100.
Yes.
Maybe it won't be 100 degrees when we do our 100th session. I hope not. I hope we, kind of like Missoula, we start cooling down a little bit.
I just put that in my Google Calendar. And I labeled it so he won't forget. It will be session 100.
God's goodness to you, Mike, and
to
all
you,
the listeners.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. I hope that you got something out of it. I know I did.
Respond some way to our session and even email us. We put the email on the down at the description
Yes.
of each session, and I anxiously open my computer every day thinking there's going to be dozens of emails discussing our lessons, but
Yes.
I rarely find one.
Yeah. So far, crickets. Thanks, everyone.